So when they captured me at Normandy, the American soldier looked at my uniform. It was a German uniform, but I was Korean, with a Japanese passport. I'd had Soviet training. How was I supposed to explain that? Yang Kyoungjong, one man, 3 different armies, 3 different countries, and he had chosen none of them, Korea, under Japanese colonial rule. Yang Kyoungjong was born that year, in a small town. He grew up under Japanese administration, went to Japanese schools, lived under Japanese law. He was a stranger in his own country. Korea had been under Japanese rule since 1910. The Korean language had been restricted, Korean culture suppressed, and Korean men were required to work for the Japanese Empire. By the time Yang turned 18, Japan was at war, fighting in China, fighting in Manchuria, and they needed soldiers. Yang Kyoungjong was taken into the Imperial Japanese Army. He hadn't made a choice. He had no right to make one. He put on a uniform, picked up a rifle, and was sent to Manchuria. What he thought out there, we don't fully know. He kept no diary. He wrote no letters. Or if he did, they never arrived. But one thing we know. In Manchuria, there was a border. And on the other side of that border was the Soviet Union. And in 1939, something happened at that border.
Yang Kyoungjong's story is documented as one of the most remarkable individual accounts of the Second World War. Born in 1920, Yang grew up in Korea under Japanese colonial rule. Japan's annexation of Korea had taken place in 1910, and Korean men could be conscripted into Japanese military service. Yang's story is a rare example of how colonialism, prisoner of war status, and forced conscription could intersect in a single life. While not every detail of his story has been fully verified, the basic outline is documented.
May 1939, Khalkhin Gol, on the border between Manchuria and Mongolia. Japanese and Soviet forces were facing each other across the border. It wasn't a declared war, but men were dying, with real bullets, real artillery. Yang was positioned somewhere on that front. The Japanese army had underestimated the Soviets. The forces under General Zhukov responded with far greater strength than anyone had anticipated. Tanks came, artillery came, and the Japanese lines broke. Yang was somewhere in the middle of that collapse. What he felt on that battlefield, we don't know. But what we do know is this: he survived that day, and he was taken prisoner. When Soviet soldiers seized him, what did they see? An Asian young man inside a Japanese uniform. They questioned him. He told them he was Korean. Did they believe him? Disbelieve him? The records aren't complete, but something happened. Yang was sent to a Soviet prisoner of war camp in Siberia. He spent years there. Cold, hunger, uncertainty. While the war continued far away, time seemed to have stopped inside the camp. Then, in 1942, something changed. The Germans were advancing. The Soviets were losing men, and the Soviets made a decision. An offer was made to certain men in the prisoner camps.
The Battle of Khalkhin Gol ran from May to September 1939. This border conflict between Japan and the Soviet Union has never received the attention it deserves in history books. But it matters greatly to military historians. General Georgy Zhukov developed the tank and mechanized force tactics in this battle that he would later use against Germany. Japanese casualties were heavy, and this defeat was a significant factor in Japan's later decision to expand into the Pacific rather than attack the Soviet Union. Korean soldiers like Yang served in Japanese ranks throughout this engagement.
Soviet prisoner of war camp, Siberia. The offer was this: fight for the Soviet army. Get out of captivity, maybe survive, or stay in the camp, in the cold, in the hunger, in the uncertainty. What did Yang think? We don't know, but we know what he decided. He put on a Soviet uniform. That decision wasn't simple. Fighting for the Soviets meant fighting against the Germans. The Germans were deep inside Soviet territory at that time. Death was around every corner, but the prisoner camp was death too, just slower. Yang moved forward. In Soviet ranks, a Korean man, captured in a Japanese uniform, now inside a Soviet uniform. In Eastern Europe, fighting Germans. You might say this story makes no sense, but war makes no sense either. And then in 1943, something happened again. The Germans were advancing, Soviet lines were breaking, and Yang was captured again. This time the Germans took him. They questioned him. Who was this man? An Asian face in a Soviet uniform. He explained. Korean, former Japanese soldier, then Soviet army. The Germans looked at him, thought about it, and another offer was made.
Throughout the Second World War, the German army recruited soldiers, both voluntarily and by force, from occupied territories and prisoner camps. This practice was directed primarily at prisoners taken from the Soviet Union. These auxiliary forces, known as Hiwis, took on various roles within the German army. Some prisoners were used in frontline combat, others were assigned to logistics. Yang's incorporation into German ranks was part of this system. Whether it was voluntary or forced remains a matter of historical debate.
France. The Atlantic Wall. Yang Kyoungjong was inside a German uniform on the Normandy coast, in German defensive positions. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, everything changed. D-Day. American paratroopers descended in the darkness of the night. German positions dissolved into chaos. Fighting everywhere. Explosions everywhere. What did Yang feel that night? 4 years earlier, he had been in Manchuria, in a Japanese uniform, on the receiving end of a Soviet assault. 3 years earlier, he had been in Siberia, in a Soviet uniform, sent to the German front. Now he was in France, in a German uniform, under American assault. Every time a different place, every time a different uniform, but every time the same thing, trying to stay alive. When morning came, American paratroopers reached the position. Yang surrendered. When the Americans saw him, they stopped. A German uniform, but an Asian face. We can imagine what they asked, who he was, where he came from, why he was here. Yang answered, not in English, of course, in Japanese, in Korean, maybe a little Russian. The Americans didn't understand. No interpreter, no communication. Just one man, in a German uniform, with a story they couldn't begin to follow.
On D-Day, June 6, 1944, paratroopers from the American 101st Airborne Division dropped into the interior of Normandy. Some units are known to have drifted from their intended drop zones. German defensive positions at that time included soldiers of various nationalities who had been brought to Western Europe. The exact circumstances of Yang's capture have not been fully documented, but records do exist of a Korean soldier captured in a German uniform on the morning of D-Day. Those records went unnoticed in military archives for many years.
England. Prisoner of war camp. 1944. Yang was sent to the camp along with the other German prisoners, but he was different. Everyone could see it. The German prisoners looked at him. The American guards looked at him. Everyone looked. Who is this man? Questions came. Slowly, an interpreter was found, someone who spoke Japanese, and Yang began to tell his story. As he told it, he watched the faces change. They couldn't believe it, or didn't want to. One man, 3 armies, 3 countries, 3 wars. They checked the records, couldn't fully verify it, but couldn't disprove it either. Yang sat in the camp, German soldiers all around him. What was he feeling inside? He never fully said, but one thing we know. In that camp, he felt something for the first time. He was safe, no war, no uniform, no front line, just a camp and life. Maybe for the first time, he sat down and thought, what had happened since 1938? Manchuria, Siberia, Ukraine, France, England, 6 years, 3 armies, and none of it had been his choice. The exhaustion wasn't only in his body, it went much deeper than that.
Soldiers who were forced to fight for more than one army were not unique to Yang's situation. During the Second World War, many soldiers from Eastern Europe and Asia were swept up in the waves of the war and ended up fighting on different sides. But Yang's story is exceptional in that he actually served in the armies of 3 separate major powers. This represents a concrete example of how colonialism, forced conscription, and war can shape an individual. Historians consider this story one of the most striking illustrations of the human cost of war.
The war ended, 1945. Yang Kyoungjong was released. He didn't go back to Korea. Maybe he couldn't, or maybe he didn't want to. What was there in Korea? Japan had been defeated. Korea was free now. But Yang's family, his home, he didn't know. He stayed in America. He settled in Illinois, in a small town, quietly. He never told anyone who he was. His neighbors knew him as an ordinary immigrant. Maybe that was enough. Maybe all he wanted was ordinariness. An ordinary morning, an ordinary breakfast, an ordinary day. Without a uniform, without orders, without war. Years passed. He never gave an interview, never wrote a book, never spoke about it. After his death, his story slowly came to light. Military archives, prisoner records, and the testimonies of the paratroopers who had captured him on the morning of D-Day. The story spread, slowly, but it spread. And people asked, how was this even possible? The answer was actually simple. Colonialism, war, and the instinct to survive. 3 words. Yang's 6 years.
Yang Kyoungjong's story remained almost entirely unknown for decades. It first attracted the attention of military historians in the 1990s. In the years that followed, it became the subject of various documentaries and historical publications. The significance of the story goes beyond individual tragedy. It shows how Japanese colonialism shaped Korean individuals, how war reduces people to instruments, and how the instinct for survival can make concepts like political loyalty meaningless. Yang never fought for an ideology. He just wanted to live.
Yang Kyoungjong died in 1992 in Illinois, at home. His neighbors described him as a calm, quiet man. He tended his garden. He talked with the people next door, but he never spoke about his past. Never. One neighbor said years later, "I thought I knew him well. I learned his story after he died. It turned out I didn't know him at all." Yang had children. He had grandchildren. They didn't fully know either what their father had been through, what their grandfather had lived. Maybe he didn't want to say it. Maybe he couldn't find the words. A young Korean man who put on a Japanese uniform in 1938. He had chosen nothing. He had simply been born at the wrong time, in the wrong place, under the colonial rule of the wrong empire. And that wrong beginning took him to Manchuria, took him to Siberia, took him to Ukraine, took him to France, took him to England, and finally to Illinois. 6 years, 4 continents, 3 armies, and none of it had been his choice. War history is usually built around decisions. Who attacked where? Who held where? Who won? Who lost? Yang made no decisions. Decisions were made for him, every time. And every time the only thing he did was this: survive. That might sound simple, it isn't. Surviving is sometimes the hardest thing, especially when you're not sure which side you're on, especially when you know that none of the sides is really yours. Yang knew that. He knew it for 6 years, and he knew it while growing flowers in his garden in Illinois. Maybe that garden was the answer to everything. The war was over, no uniform, no orders, just soil and hands and things that grow.
Yang Kyoungjong's story is finding an increasing place in discussions of both war history and colonialism today. It has entered Korean school textbooks. It has been the subject of international documentaries. The significance of the story comes from this: Yang was not a hero. He was not a traitor. He was simply a person pulled into the current of war. He made no sacrifice for Japan, none for the Soviets, none for Germany. He just lived. And sometimes, in history, the most important thing is not the great decisions. It is the small lives. Yang's story is the clearest evidence of that.